Close your eyes and imagine standing on a hillside overlooking a silent city. No traffic noise, no distant voices, no hum of humanity that has filled your ears since birth. 8 billion people gone. Only 100,000 remain scattered across the entire planet. That's fewer people than currently live in a single neighborhood of most major cities, spread across the entire Earth. Tonight, we explore a question grounded not in fantasy, but in science. Could humanity survive with just 100,000 people? Would our genetics sustain us? Could we maintain civilization? What would happen to nuclear power plants, to food systems, to the knowledge we've spent millennia accumulating? This is not a story of apocalypse, but of transformation. A scientific exploration of what happens when Earth's most dominant species becomes one of its rarest. As we journey through this near-factual scenario together, let the weight of today dissolve. Let your breathing slow, and discover a world both haunting and strangely peaceful. Are you ready to witness Earth transformed? Then settle into comfort, release your concerns, and let us explore what remains when almost everyone is gone. You find yourself standing on a hillside, overlooking what was once a bustling city. But the year is now 2030, and everything has changed. Where 8 billion people once lived, worked, and dreamed, only 100,000 remain scattered across the entire planet. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind moving through abandoned streets and the calls of birds reclaiming territories they had lost centuries ago. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you will explore what this transformed world would truly be like, not through fantasy, but through the lens of science, genetics, infrastructure, and the stubborn resilience of both nature and humanity. This is a story grounded in the realities of minimum viable populations, the decay of complex systems, and the question of whether such a small group of humans could even survive, let alone thrive. The genetic threat. Can 100,000 people sustain humanity? You settle into a comfortable position and contemplate the first and perhaps most critical question. Is 100,000 people enough to ensure the long-term survival of the human species? The answer, according to conservation biology, is complex and sobering. The famous 50-50-100 rule in conservation biology states that a population needs 50 individuals to prevent inbreeding depression and 500 individuals to guard against genetic drift. But these are effective population sizes, not census populations. Research suggests that the ratio of effective population to census population is typically between 0.1 and 0.2, meaning for every 5 to 10 individuals counted, only one is effective genetically. By this calculation, your 100,000 survivors would have an effective population of only 10,000 to 20,000 individuals. This is better than the minimum, but concerning. Research from 2000 suggested that in sub-Saharan Africa, human numbers could have dropped as low as 2,000 for perhaps as long as 100,000 years before expanding again. So humanity has survived such bottlenecks before, but at what cost? As evening deepens around you and your breathing slows, you think about what this means. Population bottlenecks reduce variation in the gene pool, and genetic diversity remains lower afterward, increasing only very slowly with time as random mutations occur. The 100,000 survivors would see reduced genetic diversity, potentially making the species more vulnerable to diseases and environmental changes. Northern elephant seals, whose population fell to about 30 in the 1890s, now number in the hundreds of thousands, but have much less genetic variation than southern elephant seals that were not so intensely hunted. Your remnant humanity would face similar challenges, a permanent genetic scar that would persist for millennia. The infrastructure crisis, when complex systems collapse. As night settles more deeply and stars begin to appear overhead, you turn your attention to a more immediate threat than genetics: the collapse of the infrastructure that makes modern life possible. With only 100,000 people scattered across Earth, maintaining the complex technological systems that sustain civilization would be impossible. Consider nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants currently operate in 31 countries and generate about a tenth of the world's electricity. These facilities require constant monitoring, cooling, and maintenance by trained specialists. Without this care, they become catastrophically dangerous. The Chernobyl disaster killed about 30 people directly and is estimated to lead to an additional 4,000 cancer-related deaths, with over $7 billion in property damages, and approximately 350,000 people were forcibly resettled. Now, imagine not one, but hundreds of nuclear facilities around the world slowly failing without proper oversight. Your 100,000 survivors would need to evacuate vast areas as reactor after reactor failed, creating exclusion zones that would render entire regions uninhabitable for centuries. The gentle sounds of the night surround you as you contemplate this grim reality. With such a small population, there simply wouldn't be enough trained nuclear engineers, enough replacement parts, or enough organizational capacity to safely shut down all these facilities. Many would be forced to simply walk away from operating reactors, hoping that automatic safety systems would prevent complete meltdowns, but knowing that eventually those systems would fail. The food paradox: abundance and challenge. Your thoughts drift to a more hopeful consideration as sleep begins to tug at the edges of your consciousness. At least food wouldn't be a problem, would it? After all, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the world currently produces more than 1.5 times enough food to feed everyone on the planet, enough to feed 10 billion people. With only 100,000 people, there would be food enough for 100 lifetimes in the world's warehouses and grain silos. But this abundance presents its own challenges. Modern agriculture depends on complex supply chains, refrigeration, pesticides, and fuel, all requiring industrial systems that your tiny population couldn't maintain. The immediate aftermath wouldn't be terrible. Canned goods, dried foods, and preserved supplies would last for years. But eventually, your survivors would need to return to more traditional forms of agriculture, working with simpler tools and local knowledge. The challenge wouldn't be producing enough food. It would be preserving knowledge of how to produce food without tractors, chemical fertilizers, or modern seed varieties. As your breathing deepens into the rhythm of approaching sleep, you imagine communities gathering in the most fertile regions, establishing small farms using saved seeds and traditional methods. They would have access to warehouses full of tools and supplies, but without the industrial base to produce new ones, each broken shovel or worn-out seed drill would be irreplaceable. The geographical question: where would people gather? The stars wheel slowly overhead as you contemplate where your 100,000 survivors might choose to live. The Earth's current infrastructure is designed for 8 billion people, not 100,000. The logical strategy would be to concentrate in a few favorable locations rather than spreading thinly across the globe. Coastal regions with mild climates, access to fishing, and fertile land would be prime candidates. Perhaps one community in Mediterranean Europe, another in California, a third in New Zealand, and others scattered strategically around the globe to preserve genetic and cultural diversity. But this concentration would mean abandoning vast swaths of human civilization, entire continents left to return to wilderness. You picture the great cities of the world slowly falling silent: New York, Tokyo, Mumbai, Lagos, all those monuments to human ambition and industry standing empty, their streets gradually claimed by vegetation, their buildings slowly crumbling without maintenance. The New Zealand black robin, of which every specimen today is a descendant of a single female called Old Blue, survived an extreme genetic bottleneck, but it required careful management. Your human remnant would need similar wisdom about where and how to concentrate their limited numbers. The knowledge crisis. What would be lost? As sleep draws nearer, you reflect on perhaps the most poignant aspect of this scenario: the knowledge that would be lost. Modern civilization depends on deep specialization, countless experts in narrow fields, each holding pieces of humanity's accumulated wisdom. With only 100,000 people, maintaining this specialized knowledge would be impossible. There might be no neurosurgeons in your remnant population, no quantum physicists, no experts in medieval Sanskrit or ancient Sumerian. Even if some specialists survived, who would they teach? With such a small population, everyone would need to focus on immediate survival rather than preserving esoteric knowledge. Libraries would stand full of books that no one had time to read. Data centers would slowly lose power and corrupt, taking with them centuries of digitized information. The internet itself would fail as servers went offline and fiber optic networks degraded without maintenance. Your survivors would have to make difficult choices about what knowledge to prioritize: medical information, agricultural techniques, basic engineering, letting other domains fade away like dreams upon waking. The question of technology. What could be maintained? Your thoughts become dreamier as consciousness begins to slip away. What level of technology could 100,000 people actually sustain? Certainly not the microchip fabrication facilities that require thousands of specialists and billions of dollars in equipment. Not the pharmaceutical industry with its complex supply chains and specialized chemical processes. Your remnant humanity would likely regress to approximately 19th century technology levels. Steam power, basic metallurgy, simple chemistry. They would have access to books and plans for more advanced technology, but lack the population base to implement it. A community of 100,000 people could perhaps maintain a radio network, simple electrical generation, and basic medical care, but computers, antibiotics, and advanced medicine would gradually become unavailable. The irony would be profound. surrounded by the wealth of modern civilization, unable to use most of it. Like children in a toy store after closing, able to look, but not to maintain. The survivors would scavenge what they could from the abandoned world, stretching resources, repairing and adapting, but always aware that each irreplaceable item brought them one step closer to a simpler existence. The ecological recovery. Nature returns. As you drift deeper towards sleep, a more peaceful image emerges. With only 100,000 people, human impact on the environment would dramatically decrease. Agriculture is among the greatest contributors to global warming, emitting more greenhouse gases than all cars, trucks, trains, and airplanes combined. With such a small population, this pressure would largely evaporate. Forests would begin to reclaim farmland. Wildlife populations, no longer hunted or displaced by expanding human settlements, would recover. The oceans, relieved of industrial fishing, would see fish stocks rebound. Air quality would improve dramatically as factories stood idle and vehicles rusted in place. Within decades, many formerly endangered species would no longer be threatened. You imagine wolves returning to European cities, elephants wandering through abandoned African towns, whales filling seas no longer churned by constant shipping traffic. The Earth would heal in ways not seen since before the Industrial Revolution, perhaps not seen since before agriculture itself began 10,000 years ago. The social challenges. Building community. Your consciousness hovers in that pleasant state between waking and sleep as you consider the social dynamics of your remnant population. 100,000 people globally means perhaps only a few thousand in any given region. Building functional communities would require cooperation on an unprecedented scale. Old national and ethnic divisions would become meaningless. There simply wouldn't be enough people to maintain separate societies. Survivors would need to work together regardless of former allegiances, sharing knowledge and resources to ensure mutual survival. In some ways, this might create a more unified humanity, forced by necessity to see beyond old prejudices. But human nature doesn't change with population size. There would still be conflicts over resources, leadership, and decision-making. Your small communities would need to develop governance systems that worked at this scale, neither the tribal systems of ancient humanity nor the vast bureaucracies of modern nations, but something in between. The psychological impact. Loneliness on a global scale. As sleep claims more of your awareness, you contemplate the psychological toll of living in such a depopulated world. The survivors would be haunted by absence, empty cities, silent highways, dark buildings standing like tombstones for a vanished civilization. The loneliness would be profound, knowing that vast distances separated the scattered remnants of humanity. Communication would be treasured. Perhaps survivors would maintain some radio networks, spending evenings listening to broadcasts from other communities thousands of miles away, reassuring themselves that they weren't alone. Young people would grow up in a world where seeing another human face was a notable event rather than a daily occurrence. Yet there might also be a strange kind of peace in this isolation. Freedom from the constant noise and demands of modern society. Time to contemplate, to build slowly, to live at a more human scale. Your survivors might find that quality of life improved in some ways, even as material abundance decreased. The question of children. Population recovery. Your breathing has become slow and regular as you think about the future of your remnant humanity.
Could 100,000 people grow back to billions? Theoretically, yes, but it would take centuries, and the path would be fraught with danger. If the population maintained even a modest growth rate, doubling every generation or two, it could reach millions within a few centuries. But this assumes stable conditions, adequate nutrition, low infant mortality, and the absence of catastrophic events. With limited medical care and knowledge, childbirth would become dangerous again. Disease outbreaks in small communities could be devastating. The survivors would need to prioritize genetic diversity in mate selection, perhaps keeping careful records to avoid inbreeding in isolated communities. They would need to maintain connections between distant groups to allow for genetic exchange. The careful management would resemble conservation programs for endangered species, because that's essentially what humanity would have become. The cultural preservation. What defines us? As you slip further into the peaceful realm of dreams, you reflect on what cultural elements your remnant humanity might preserve. With no resources to waste on non-essentials, what would survivors deem important enough to maintain? Music and storytelling would likely persist, requiring no technology beyond human voices and simple instruments. Religious and philosophical traditions would adapt to new circumstances. Perhaps survivors would develop new spiritualities, reflecting their transformed relationship with a depopulated Earth. The great religions of past ages might blend and evolve, shaped by the necessity of cooperation and the humbling experience of survival. Art would continue, but focused on available materials, painting with natural pigments, sculpture with salvaged materials, poetry and stories passed orally when paper became scarce. Your survivors would create new myths to explain their world and their place in it. Legends about the time before the Great Emptying, cautionary tales about hubris and resilience. The long view, 1,000 years hence. Your consciousness has almost fully released into sleep as you imagine the world a millennium after the Great Reduction. By then, your survivors' descendants might number in the millions, slowly rebuilding civilization from salvaged knowledge and hard-won experience. They would live in a world profoundly shaped by the bottleneck, less diverse genetically, more cautious about population growth, more aware of ecological limits. The ruins of the old civilization would dot the landscape, mysterious structures from the time of billions, repurposed or avoided or studied by descendant peoples trying to understand their ancestors. Ancient highways would serve as quarries for building materials. Skyscrapers would be vertical forests, their steel bones hosting ecosystems never imagined by their builders. Perhaps these future humans would be wiser, having learned from the collapse that brought their founding population so low. Or perhaps they would repeat the same mistakes, their population growing until once again it pressed against planetary limits.
The cycle might continue. Expansion, collapse, recovery, as it has for countless species throughout Earth's history. The abundance paradox. Wealth without heirs. As you rest in peaceful semi-consciousness, you contemplate a strange irony. Your 100,000 survivors would be, in a sense, the richest people ever to live. They would have access to all the accumulated material wealth of 8 billion people, warehouses full of goods, libraries full of knowledge, technologies beyond the dreams of ancient kings. Yet they would be unable to use most of this wealth. Like shipwreck survivors on an island made of gold, the treasures around them would be worthless without the civilization to support them.
The most valuable resources would be the simplest: seeds that still sprouted, tools that didn't require replacement parts, knowledge that could be applied with available materials. This would represent a profound shift in human values. Luxury goods would become meaningless. A smartphone would be worthless, but a sharp axe would be priceless. A sports car would be scrap metal, but a bicycle with working tires would be treasure. Your survivors would learn anew what true value meant, not market prices or brand names, but practical utility for sustaining life. The hope, resilience of life. As sleep fully embraces you, your final thoughts turn to hope. Humanity has survived bottlenecks before, possibly dropping as low as 2,000 individuals for as long as 100,000 years. If ancestors could survive with stone tools and no written knowledge, perhaps descendants could survive with the remnants of modern technology and written records of human achievement. Life is remarkably resilient. Given time and favorable conditions, populations recover. The northern elephant seals rebounded from near extinction to hundreds of thousands. Your human remnant, with their knowledge and adaptability, would have advantages no other species ever possessed. The Earth itself would thrive with reduced human pressure. Perhaps the great lesson would be learning to live as partners with the planet rather than its dominators, maintaining a population and lifestyle in balance with ecological limits. Your survivors might build a civilization different from the one that fell, wiser about sustainability, humbler about their place in the web of life. The dream of tomorrow. In the deepest reaches of sleep, you dream of the distant future. You see communities gathered around fires, telling stories of the time when billions lived. You see children playing in gardens that were once parking lots, learning to read by candlelight from preserved books. You see young people falling in love across distances their ancestors would have thought impossibly small, celebrating the simple fact of finding another human in the vastness. You see farmers working soil enriched by decades of rest, harvesting abundance from land no longer depleted by intensive agriculture. You see teachers carefully preserving knowledge, knowing that every skill taught might be the thread that keeps civilization from unraveling completely. You see elders passing down wisdom about living lightly on the earth, about community, about what truly matters when everything else has been stripped away. And perhaps most importantly, you see hope, the indomitable human spirit that has carried our species through ice ages and droughts, through plagues and conflicts, through every catastrophe that history has thrown at us. 100,000 people scattered across a planet built for billions, but alive, adapting, enduring, and daring to dream of a future where their descendants might once again fill the earth. The peaceful certainty. Your sleep is deep now, undisturbed by the contemplation of such dramatic changes. In the end, whether humanity could survive with just 100,000 people depends on countless variables: where they lived, what knowledge they preserved, how well they cooperated, what genetic diversity they maintained, whether they could manage a gradual return to simpler technologies while avoiding complete collapse. The answer, like so much in life, is uncertain. But one thing is certain: life continues, adapts, persists. Whether with 8 billion people or 100,000, the story of humanity is one of resilience, creativity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstances. And in that knowledge, you find peace.
The night is deep, the world is quiet, and sleep carries you gently into dreams where the impossible becomes possible. where 100,000 candles of human consciousness shine bravely in the darkness, each one a promise that the light will continue, that the story will go on, that life, precious, improbable, infinitely adaptable life, will find a way. Rest now in this knowledge, and let the gentle rhythm of your breathing match the patient pulse of a planet that has seen countless species rise and fall, that has weathered extinctions and renewals, and that would survive and thrive regardless of humanity's numbers. You are part of something larger than yourself, larger even than your species, part of the great web of life that has persisted for billions of years and will persist for billions more. Sleep peacefully, knowing that in scenarios both dire and hopeful, life endures, adapts, and continues its ancient dance beneath the unchanging stars.